Imagine stepping out into your garden on a soft morning, the air still cool, a cup of tea warming your hands. The soil looks quiet, yet beneath it a whole universe of life is at work. Now, what if I told you that the secret to multiplying that underground life doesn't come from an expensive bag of fertilizer, but from something most of us keep tucked away in our pantry? Rice, simple, humble, often taken for granted, can do far more than fill a plate. When gently crushed and sprinkled into the earth, it becomes food for the invisible helpers we rarely see, the microbes and worms that keep soil rich and plants strong. I remember the first time I heard this idea. It felt almost too simple to be true. But much like how a kind word can brighten a whole day, a handful of rice can set off ripples of health across a garden. Today, let's wander together through this quiet trick and discover how a kitchen staple can breathe new life into your soil. When you think of rice, you probably picture a bowl on the dinner table steaming gently, a comfort food that has warmed generations. But in the garden, rice carries a quieter, almost magical role. Inside each grain are starches and carbohydrates, which act like a steady breakfast for the tiny, unseen workers of your soil, the microbes. These organisms are as important to plants as air and sunlight. They break down fallen leaves, scraps of compost, and old roots, turning them into nutrients plants can drink in. Without them, soil becomes tired and lifeless. Think of microbes as the librarians of your garden. They organize, file, and share resources. Now imagine handing those librarians a supply of patient, long-lasting fuel, not candy that gives a quick rush, but a meal that sustains them all day. That's what crushed rice does underground. Unlike white sugar or fruit scraps that vanish quickly, rice breaks down slowly, feeding microbes steadily for weeks. It's like putting a log on a campfire instead of twigs. The warmth lasts longer and burns more evenly. I once visited a neighbor who swore by this method. She had a small patch of tomatoes in her backyard, nothing grand, but her plants looked greener than mine ever had. When she pulled a handful of soil aside, I noticed the fine white strands of fungi weaving through the dirt like threads in a quilt. That's the rice, she told me. I sprinkle just a little every few weeks, and the soil never seems to get tired. The look on her face was pure pride, the kind that comes when we realize we've learned a trick our grandparents might have smiled at. There's a deeper beauty here, too. Feeding soil with rice isn't just about plant growth. It's about remembering that even the smallest things we add matter. Many of us know what it's like to feel overlooked with age, yet still carry strength, wisdom, and worth. Rice reminds us of that. A grain so small, once thought insignificant, can quietly nurture an entire garden community. For older gardeners or those who may not have the energy for heavy lifting anymore, this trick is gentle. You don't need to haul bags of amendments or mix complicated formulas. A handful of crushed rice worked softly into the soil is enough. Over time, you'll notice that earthy smell that reminds you of a forest floor after rain. It's a scent of life, of work being done where we can't always see it. That's how you'll know the rice is working, not loudly, not quickly, but with the patience and grace that mirrors the pace of our own lives as we learn to value steadiness over speed. If you've ever dug into a healthy patch of earth, you've probably felt that quiet thrill when a worm wriggles into view. For many of us, it brings back childhood memories of fishing trips or of helping a parent turn the soil for spring planting. Worms are more than just a sign of life. They're partners in keeping our gardens rich. But here's a secret: not everyone knows worms don't thrive on soil alone. They depend on microbes. Without an abundant supply of microbes to feed on, worms simply cannot multiply. When you add crushed rice, you're really feeding the smallest workers first, the bacteria and fungi. And as they flourish, the worms arrive like dinner guests invited to a banquet. They eat the microbes, and in doing so, they stir the soil, leave behind nutrient-rich castings, and create tiny tunnels that help air and water flow. It's a cycle of giving and receiving. Microbes feed worms, worms feed plants, and plants feed us. I recall visiting an older gentleman who had been gardening for more than 50 years. His garden wasn't large, just a neat set of raised beds behind his house. He told me that after he began adding crushed rice, he noticed an explosion of worms within weeks. He laughed as he explained how his grandchildren, fascinated by the sudden abundance of garden snakes, would spend afternoons counting them. "The worms are back," he said with a twinkle in his eye. "And so are the kids." It was a reminder that sometimes the joy of gardening isn't only in the harvest, but in the life it brings all around. This bond between microbes and worms is also a lesson in patience. We live in a world that often asks for quick fixes, faster growth, bigger yields, instant results. But the garden teaches us otherwise. By caring for the invisible life beneath the soil, by starting with something as small as a handful of rice, we set the stage for abundance. The worms will come in their own time when the banquet is ready. For those of us who may move a little slower now, there's comfort in knowing that we don't have to rush either. Just as worms wait for the right conditions, we can let our gardens unfold at their own pace. Watching worms return is like watching an old friendship rekindle, steady, sure, and deeply rewarding. And the soil in turn becomes lighter, healthier, and better able to cradle the roots of whatever you choose to grow. You might wonder, why not just toss a scoop of whole rice into the garden and let nature take its course? The truth is, whole grains of rice often sit stubbornly in the soil for months, hardly breaking down at all. Sometimes, if the weather is damp and warm, they even sprout into tiny rice plants, which may not be what you want growing among your flowers or vegetables. That's why crushing the rice is such an important step. Smaller pieces allow microbes to settle in more quickly, breaking the rice down at just the right pace, not too fast, not too slow. Think of it like preparing a meal for a dear friend. If you serve something in one giant lump, it's hard to chew and enjoy. But if you cut it into smaller bites, it becomes easier to savor. The same goes for the soil. When you crush rice, you're giving those microbes a portion size they can handle, something they can work through without being overwhelmed. And in return, they'll keep feeding your plants steadily over time. The good news is you don't need fancy tools to get it right. I know an older gardener who simply wraps a handful of rice in an old kitchen towel, sets it on a sturdy counter, and gives it a few gentle taps with a rolling pin. Another friend who has arthritis in her wrists prefers to place rice in a small bag and lightly press it with the heel of her foot. Simple, no strain, and surprisingly effective. Crushing doesn't mean grinding it into flour. In fact, that would make it disappear too quickly in the soil. Aim for fragments smaller than a whole grain, but still visible like broken pearls. I remember the first time I tried it myself. I used a mortar and pestle, slowly turning the rice into coarse pieces, the sound of cracking grains echoing softly in my kitchen. Later, as I scattered those fragments into my raised beds, I felt almost like I was planting little gifts for the soil. Weeks later, when I knelt down and turned the earth, I found it looser, smelling sweeter, and filled with tiny threads of fungal life. That's when I knew the crushing step wasn't just a detail. It was the heart of the trick. For those of us seeking simpler, gentler ways to garden as we grow older, this step offers both practicality and meaning. It reminds us that sometimes it's the small adjustments, the careful attention to detail that make all the difference. A few minutes of preparation turns a common pantry item into a slow-release treasure for the earth. And like so many things in life, breaking down what's hard to handle often creates something more nourishing in the end. Balance is the gardener's best friend. Too much water drowns the roots. Too much fertilizer burns them, and too much rice can cause its own set of problems. That's why the measure matters. A good starting place is about 1 cup of crushed rice for every square foot of soil. It sounds modest, almost too little to make a difference, but nature thrives on moderation. Just as our bodies feel better with steady, balanced meals instead of feasts or fasts, the soil responds best to gentle, thoughtful care. I once spoke with a woman who decided to treat her entire vegetable patch with nearly an entire bag of rice. Within a week, she noticed ants gathering where the grains had been scattered. By piling on too much, she unintentionally invited pests. On the other hand, I've seen gardeners who sprinkle just a light dusting into their soil, and then wonder why nothing seems to change. The lesson here is that moderation is not only practical but essential. When we strike the right balance, we give the microbes and worms exactly what they need without tipping the scales. The method is simple. Scatter the crushed rice over the soil, then gently mix it into the top 2 or 3 inches. This step is more important than it might seem. If left on the surface, rice becomes an easy snack for birds, ants, or even curious rodents. But tucked into the soil, it remains hidden where the underground workers can find it. You don't need to dig deep, just a light raking or turning of the soil with your hands will do. Many older gardeners prefer using a small hand tool or even wearing soft gloves to gently fold it in, which saves bending and strain. What I love about this practice is how accessible it feels. You don't have to measure with strict precision. A coffee mug or small bowl works fine as a guide. And you don't have to finish it all in one day. Perhaps 1 square foot today, another tomorrow. Gardening isn't a race. It's a rhythm, and our bodies often thank us when we move at an easier pace. Over time, those small, steady contributions build into something powerful. This idea of just enough carries over into life as well. So often we push ourselves to do more, to give more, forgetting that sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing when to stop. The garden teaches us that enough truly is enough. A single cup of rice properly placed can transform the soil far more than a careless handful tossed in haste. And maybe that's why this practice feels almost like a meditation, a reminder that care, not quantity, is what nurtures lasting growth. Timing is as important as the act itself. Just as we know to plant tomatoes after the last frost or harvest herbs before they flower, adding crushed rice to your soil works best in certain seasons. Spring and fall are the golden windows. In spring, the soil is waking up moist and mild, buzzing with renewed microbial life, eager for fuel. In fall, the ground is still warm but not scorching, and worms are especially active, preparing the earth before the long rest of winter. By giving rice, then you're meeting the soil at its most receptive moments. I remember a neighbor who tried this in the peak of July, scattering crushed rice beneath her rose bushes. Within days, the blazing sun had dried it out, leaving the grains brittle and useless. She watered faithfully, but the heat was too much, and the rice never truly decomposed. Later in September, she tried again. This time, with cooler air and more regular rains, she saw a different story. A softer soil surface, a few more worms surfacing, and roses that seemed to glow with late-season color. It was proof that timing transforms the outcome. Winter, by contrast, is a season of stillness for the soil. Just as we tuck under warm blankets, microbes and worms slow almost to a stop when the earth freezes. If you add rice, then it won't harm anything. It will simply wait, resting in place until warmth returns. Summer can work if you're willing to water consistently, keeping the grains moist enough to break down. But for those of us who prefer easier methods, it's wiser to save the effort for spring and fall. This timing also spares the gardener unnecessary labor. Working with the seasons means letting nature carry some of the load. In spring, rains soften the soil, making it easier on older hands and backs to fold rice into the top layer. In fall, the cooler air makes time outdoors more pleasant without the fatigue of heat or the stiffness of winter cold. Gardening becomes less of a chore and more of a shared dance with the rhythms of the earth. In many ways, this practice is a lesson in patience and trust. We can't control the seasons, only align ourselves with them. The same holds true in life. There are moments when pushing harder brings no results, but waiting, watching, and acting at the right time brings rewards. By choosing to add rice when the soil is most alive, you set in motion a chain of growth that carries into the months ahead. And you remind yourself that sometimes the best work we do is done in season, not in haste. One of the quiet joys of gardening is learning to notice subtle changes. When you begin adding crushed rice to your soil, the first signs may not be dramatic, but they are deeply satisfying. Lean close after a few weeks, and you might catch that unmistakable fragrance, the earthy, almost sweet smell that brings to mind a damp forest after rain. That scent is the language of microbes, a signal that your underground community is alive and thriving. Another sign comes in the form of delicate white threads weaving through the soil. These fungal networks, almost like fine lace hidden beneath the surface, act as bridges between roots and nutrients. The first time I saw them, I thought I had uncovered cobwebs underground. An experienced gardener explained, "That's the soil telling you it's awake." Those threads are evidence that the rice is doing its quiet work, feeding not just microbes, but also the fungi that extend the reach of plant roots. Of course, the most visible confirmation comes from the plants themselves. Leaves take on a deeper green, stems grow sturdier, and flowers or fruit appear more vibrant. A friend once showed me her pepper plants after just one season of using crushed rice. Compared to her neighbors, which were planted in the same soil type, hers stood taller, leaves glossier, and peppers hung in clusters like ornaments on a tree. She laughed, saying, "It feels like I didn't do anything, but the rice did." And then there are the worms. More and more you'll see them wriggling through your beds, leaving behind castings that enrich the soil further. I recall an older couple who gardened side by side. The husband, who loved fishing, called it his 2-for-1 trick: healthy soil for the garden and a reliable supply of worms for his bait box. His wife, on the other hand, loved watching the soil come alive with life, knowing each worm meant her roses and beans were being cared for underground. These early signs remind us of a simple truth: growth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through scent, through hidden threads, through the slow thickening of a stem or the shimmer of a leaf. For gardeners in their golden years, this can be especially comforting. We may not move as quickly as we once did, but we know how to look closely, how to appreciate the quiet evidence of care. The rice trick rewards that kind of attentive eye, the patience to notice and the gratitude to celebrate even the smallest signs of new life. The beauty of using crushed rice isn't just in the first few weeks of improvement. It's in how the soil transforms season after season. Over time, the earth begins to loosen, shifting from hard, compact clumps to a softer texture that feels almost like cake crumbs between your fingers. Water no longer puddles on the surface, but soaks in evenly, quenching roots without drowning them. This balance, holding enough moisture while still draining well, is the sign of soil learning to care for itself. I once visited a community garden where several plots had been tended with crushed rice for 3 years straight. The difference was plain. In the treated beds, roots grew deeper, anchoring plants that stood strong even in heavy winds. Tomatoes didn't topple as easily, and corn stalks held firm through late summer storms. In contrast, the untreated soil nearby was dry and cracked, its plants needing more water and still appearing weaker. The gardeners, many of them retirees, proudly explained that their reliance on chemical fertilizers had lessened and their watering cans stayed lighter than ever before. This gradual transformation mirrors the way many of us change with age. In our youth, we often look for quick fixes, bursts of effort that give immediate results. But as the years pass, we understand the worth of patience, of building something that strengthens over time. Just as a friendship deepens across decades, or a tree grows sturdier with each ring, so too does the soil respond to steady, gentle nourishment. Rice becomes part of a rhythm, not a shortcut. Another blessing of this practice is resilience. Healthy soil doesn't just grow healthy plants, it weathers stress better. In times of drought, soil rich in microbial life holds moisture longer. In times of heavy rain, it drains without suffocating roots. The plants respond by producing fruit and flowers more consistently, even when conditions aren't ideal. One gardener told me that after years of using rice, she no longer feared the erratic swings of weather in her region. "The soil takes care of the plants," she said softly, "and I take care of the soil." Perhaps the most meaningful part is that each small act builds upon the last. A single cup of rice might not seem transformative on its own, but season after season, it leaves a legacy. Much like the way our daily habits, a walk, a kind word, a shared meal, shape the story of our lives, so too do these small gestures create a foundation for a thriving garden. It is a reminder that lasting beauty rarely comes from grand gestures, but from small, steady care that endures. One of the most comforting truths about the rice trick is its simplicity. You don't need a strong back, expensive tools, or a wallet full of money to make it work. Rice is affordable, available at every corner grocery store, and light enough to carry without strain. For gardeners who may no longer have the energy to haul heavy bags of amendments or mix complicated formulas, this method feels almost like a gift. A small scoop, a gentle crush, and a sprinkle into the soil, that's all it takes. I remember a widow in her 70s who shared her story with me. She loved her flower beds but found it harder each year to bend and lift as she once did. When she learned about the rice method, it gave her back a sense of freedom. No longer dependent on costly soil mixes or frequent trips to the garden center, she could use what was already in her pantry. It made me feel capable again, she told me, showing off marigolds and petunias that bloomed brighter than ever. The pride in her voice was unmistakable. Rice also offers something that chemical fertilizers can't harmony. Synthetic products often give plants a sudden jolt of nutrients, but disrupt the delicate balance underground. They wash away with heavy rains, leaving soil depleted and fragile. Crushed rice, on the other hand, becomes part of the soil's natural cycle. It doesn't shock or overwhelm. It simply supports, blending in quietly like a background melody that makes the whole song sweeter. Another blessing is that this method scales with your space and needs. Whether you tend a large backyard garden, a modest patio bed, or just a few pots on the balcony, rice can be used in any of these settings. For seniors who downsize from big yards to smaller spaces, it's an especially welcome discovery. You don't lose the joy of gardening when your space shrinks. In fact, you might find it grows richer when you realize how far something so small can go. In many ways, the rice trick reflects a deeper life lesson that abundance doesn't have to come from excess. We live in a culture that often tells us to buy more, do more, achieve more. But in the garden, as in life, it is often the gentle, consistent gestures that yield the greatest rewards. A few crushed grains of rice remind us that beauty can bloom from simplicity, and that none of us are too old, too limited, or too inexperienced to bring new life into the soil beneath our feet. While rice alone can spark life in your soil, its true strength shines when paired with the practices many of us already hold dear. Think of it as adding one more thread to a well-loved quilt. It doesn't replace what's there, but it weaves in to make the whole pattern stronger. If you mix crushed rice into your compost pile, for example, the starches feed microbes already at work, breaking down kitchen scraps and leaves. The pile heats more evenly, breaks down more thoroughly, and produces a richer compost for your garden beds. I once visited a gardener who used to sprinkle a handful of crushed rice every time she layered kitchen peelings and grass clippings into her compost bin. She explained that the rice seemed to wake up the pile, keeping it from going cold. When she spread the finished compost across her vegetable beds, the plants responded with lush, steady growth. She smiled, saying it felt like giving her garden a double gift, first in the compost and again in the soil. Rice also blends beautifully beneath mulch. When tucked under a blanket of leaves, straw, or wood chips, it stays moist longer and decomposes at a comfortable pace. This not only helps microbes thrive, but keeps them protected from harsh sunlight. It's a small act that multiplies the benefits of mulching, turning a single habit into a layered strategy. And when combined with organic fertilizers, rice creates balance. Fertilizer delivers a quick boost of nutrients, much like a strong cup of coffee in the morning. Rice, on the other hand, is the slow and steady breakfast that carries you through the day. Together, they give your plants both immediate and long-term support. It's not about choosing one or the other, it's about letting them complement each other, just as a garden thrives best when different flowers, herbs, and trees share the same space. This idea of synergy feels familiar to life itself. Very little that endures is built in isolation. Our happiest memories often come not from one grand gesture, but from a mixture of small acts, a kind word, a warm meal, a shared laugh. In gardening, too, it's the blending of practices that creates strength. Rice is not the star of the show, but when it joins compost, mulch, and fertilizer, it makes the entire garden sing more harmoniously. And perhaps that's why this trick feels so profound. It doesn't demand you start over, only that you add one more gentle step to what you already know. Many gardeners wonder if crushed rice works only in open soil. But the truth is, smaller spaces like containers and raised beds may benefit even more. These pockets of soil often dry out faster, lose nutrients more quickly, and can feel lifeless compared to a garden bed rooted in the earth. By mixing in crushed rice, you give microbes and worms the steady food they need to stay active even in these tighter quarters. The result is soil that feels refreshed, almost as if it had a bigger backyard to play in. I recall visiting a friend who lived in a modest apartment with only a balcony for gardening. She had pots of herbs, basil, parsley, thyme, but complained that they always seemed to lose vigor after a month or two. When she tried sprinkling crushed rice into the potting mix, the change surprised her. Within weeks, the herbs took on a deeper green and the soil no longer dried out as quickly. She laughed that her balcony smelled like an Italian kitchen every time she brushed past the pots. For her, rice wasn't just about healthier soil. It was about reclaiming joy in a space she thought too small to thrive. Raised beds, too, respond beautifully to this trick. Because they're often filled with purchased soil mixes that can grow tired over time, rice offers a simple way to replenish biology without constant trips to the store. One gardener I knew compared it to feeding the soil instead of feeding the wallet. By sprinkling crushed rice evenly through her raised beds at the start of each season, she kept her lettuces tender, her carrots straight, and her beans abundant. The key in these smaller environments is distribution. Rice should be well crushed and spread evenly through the soil, not left in clumps. This prevents mold or sprouting, ensuring every handful of soil has its share of energy. You don't need to use much, just a light sprinkle blended into the top layer is enough to spark a quiet transformation. There's also a deeper comfort in knowing this method suits every stage of life. For older gardeners who may have downsized, container gardening often becomes a practical joy, a way to keep hands in the soil without the strain of large plots. The rice trick makes those smaller gardens sing with vitality. It proves that beauty and abundance don't depend on space or size, but on care. Just as we discover in life, sometimes the smallest corners tended with love grow the brightest flowers. Behind this humble rice trick lies a larger truth about soil health, the delicate balance between carbon and nitrogen. Many of us have heard about nitrogen. It's in fertilizers, it's in grass clippings, and it's what fuels quick green growth. But carbon, though quieter, is equally essential. Think of nitrogen as the spark and carbon as the log that keeps the fire steady. Without enough carbon, soil life flares up and then fades, leaving plants hungry again. Crushed rice offers a slow, dependable source of carbon, ensuring the underground fire never goes out. I once sat with a master gardener who explained it this way. If nitrogen is your morning coffee, carbon is the oatmeal that keeps you going until lunch. His garden proved the point. He layered grass clippings with small amounts of crushed rice, creating a balance that turned his soil dark, crumbly, and alive. His vegetables didn't just grow, they flourished, standing resilient even during stretches of poor weather. Science aside, this principle feels familiar to daily living. Many of us, especially in our younger years, thrive on quick bursts of energy, long days of work, sudden projects, ambitious goals. But with age, we learn the wisdom of steady rhythms of nourishment that lasts. Just as the soil needs a balance between quick and slow fuel, so too do we. Adding rice to the garden becomes a metaphor for seeking steadiness, for choosing sustainability over exhaustion. For practical use, this balance means combining rice with other organic matter. Pair it with nitrogen-rich materials like manure, kitchen scraps, or fresh grass, and you create an environment where microbes don't just survive, but multiply. The results are healthier plants, richer soil, and a garden ecosystem that feels self-sustaining. You no longer fight against tired soil each season. Instead, you build a cycle that feeds itself. And isn't that what many of us desire in this stage of life? A sense of self-sufficiency, a rhythm that doesn't always demand more from us, but gives back steadily. Rice, in its quiet way, becomes more than a garden amendment. It's a teacher reminding us that balance is not a luxury, but a necessity, and that when we provide both quick sparks and steady fuel, life, whether in soil or in ourselves, flourishes with resilience and grace. Like any garden practice, the rice trick has its pitfalls if used without care. One of the most common errors is simply using too much. Soil, like people, can only handle so much at a time. Overloading it with rice, especially in damp or poorly drained beds, may lead to mold or sour smells. Worse, it can attract pests like ants or rodents who see the rice not as a soil amendment, but as an easy meal. The solution is simple moderation. Start with small amounts, observe, and adjust. Gardening is a conversation, and the soil will always answer if you listen closely enough. I recall a gentleman who grew enthusiastic after hearing about the rice method. He emptied nearly half a bag into one corner of his garden, hoping for spectacular results. Instead, he found the patch crawling with ants within days. Disappointed, he nearly gave up until a neighbor advised him to cut back. The following season, he tried again with just a sprinkling, carefully mixing it into the soil. This time, the results were gentle and steady, healthier plants, more worms, no pests. His smile returned along with his confidence. Another mistake is forgetting to crush the rice properly. Whole grains decompose far too slowly, sometimes sprouting instead of feeding microbes. Crushing doesn't require force, just a gentle break into smaller fragments. I've seen gardeners eager to save time scatter unbroken grains only to wonder why nothing changes. Patience in preparation makes all the difference. And finally, never leave piles of rice sitting exposed on the soil's surface. Birds will swoop down for an easy feast, and rodents may follow. A light mixing into the top few inches ensures the rice stays where it belongs underground, where microbes and worms can do their quiet work. What these lessons remind us is that even the simplest methods benefit from care and thoughtfulness. Gardening isn't about perfection. It's about observation, adjustment, and learning from both successes and missteps. Just as in life, mistakes don't mean failure, they mean refinement. The rice trick used wisely rewards restraint and attention. By keeping the practice balanced, you protect your soil, your plants, and your peace of mind. When we think of feeding soil, we often picture healthier roots and greener leaves. Yet the ripple effects of the rice trick extend far beyond what lies underground. Stronger soil builds stronger plants, and stronger plants produce more blossoms. Those blossoms in turn invite pollinators, bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds, creating a garden that hums with color and movement. It's a reminder that what we do in the dark, quiet corners of the soil eventually shows up in the brightest corners of our yards. I once visited a woman whose backyard had become her sanctuary after retirement. She sprinkled crushed rice into her flower beds every spring and fall. Within a year, she noticed not only richer soil and fuller blooms, but also a sudden chorus of buzzing and fluttering visitors. She joked that her garden had turned into a bee cafe and often sat outside in the evenings, tea in hand, simply to watch the life unfolding around her. For her, the rice was more than an amendment. It was an invitation to joy. These unexpected benefits highlight the deep connections within nature. By feeding microbes, you invite worms. By supporting worms, you enrich plants. By strengthening plants, you attract pollinators. Each step flows into the next like notes in a melody. And before long, your garden is no longer just a place of soil and stems, but a living ecosystem filled with sound, color, and vitality. For older gardeners, this can be especially meaningful. Many of us seek not only productivity, but also beauty and companionship in our gardens. To watch a butterfly pause on a flower you nurtured, or to hear the low hum of bees weaving between blooms, is to feel part of something larger and enduring. It's a gentle reminder that in caring for the soil, we are quietly caring for the creatures above it as well. So the next time you reach for rice in your pantry, think beyond the dinner table. Think of the chain of life it can spark, from microbe to worm, from root to bloom, from bloom to pollinator. What begins as a handful of crushed grains becomes a feast for an entire ecosystem. And perhaps that's the greatest gift of this simple practice. It teaches us that small, humble actions can create beauty far beyond what we imagine. At the heart of this practice lies a truth as old as gardening itself. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the simplest acts. A handful of crushed rice sprinkled into the soil with care sets off a chain reaction that awakens microbes, invites worms, strengthens plants, and even draws pollinators to your blossoms. It's not flashy, it's not costly, and it doesn't demand youth or strength to carry out. What it does demand and reward is patience, gentleness, and consistency. I once heard an older gardener describe it beautifully. She said, "The rice doesn't shout, it whispers. But if you listen, your garden will answer." Her words have stayed with me. In a world full of loud solutions and expensive fixes, there's something deeply comforting about a trick that whispers instead of shouts, that grows quietly rather than demands attention. For those of us who have seen many seasons in life, there's wisdom in this. We come to understand that resilience isn't built overnight, but over years through small, steady acts of care. Just as friendships deepen through kindness and families strengthen through simple meals shared at the table, our gardens grow strongest when we tend to them patiently. So, dear friend, the next time you scoop rice from your pantry, pause for a moment. Set a little aside for your soil. Crush it gently, fold it into the earth, and then wait. The signs will come: the scent of living soil, the shimmer of greener leaves, the return of worms wriggling happily. Over time, you'll notice your garden doesn't just survive, but thrives with a kind of grace that no store-bought product can match. And perhaps, as you watch the quiet miracle unfold, you'll also be reminded that your hands still hold the power to create beauty. Not through force or wealth, but through imagination, care, and love. That is the true lesson of this rice trick: not just healthier soil, but a reminder that life's simplest gestures often carry the deepest magic. If there is one lesson to carry from this rice trick, it is that renewal often begins with what seems ordinary. We may look at a grain of rice and see a meal, but the soil sees a promise of food, of energy, of life passed along. In the same way, we sometimes underestimate our own small actions: a smile offered to a stranger, a kind word to a neighbor, a gentle moment of care for ourselves. Yet these quiet acts ripple outward, nourishing lives we may never fully see. A friend of mine who gardens despite aching knees once told me she feels a kinship with rice. "I can't do the heavy work anymore," she said, "but I can still add something meaningful." Her garden, dotted with daisies and herbs, is proof enough. Each crushed grain she adds becomes a reminder that age does not diminish our ability to create. It simply teaches us new ways to give. So, dear friend, if you try this trick, don't just think of it as gardening. Think of it as storytelling. One handful at a time, you are writing a tale of resilience into your soil. With patience, you will watch that story unfold in blooms, in buzzing wings, in the quiet satisfaction of knowing you've given back to the earth. I'll leave you with this blessing: may your garden, no matter its size, become a place of rest, beauty, and joy. May the soil under your hands remind you that your care still matters, your creativity still blooms, and your life, like the rice you scatter, continues to nourish the world around you. Until next time, happy gardening, dear friend.